Brilliant. And thank you, Ludovic, for the introduction. Thank you, Tatiana, for the interesting talk. As it happens, I teach in a program at Tallinn University that is specifically focused on digital learning games, so games used for educational purposes and training. But that's not actually what I'm going to be talking about, because I thought I'd do something slightly different. I also happen to be, like Alicia, from Belarus originally, and I'm mostly just glad I'm not there. But here in Estonia. So let me see if I can share my screen with you. So you should be able to see the slides, is that correct? Or the one slide I'm trying to show?
We can see it, yes. Okay. Brilliant.
Okay, so let me just start my timer so I don't lose track of time. Right. So choice is a really interesting concept for game designers generally, because pretty much any game, or the vast majority of digital and non-digital games as well, you can describe the experience of playing them as going through a series of choices. What kind of choices depends a lot on the type of the game. If it's a strategy game, for example, like StarCraft, a lot of the choices will have to do with how you manage the resources that you're provided with. What do you build at what point in time? How do you use the units and the buildings and the resources to achieve the best possible outcome? If you're making a role-playing game, an important thing to consider would be what are the kind of choices available to the player that help them express their identity, or do what's called identity play and try to maybe reenact themselves as a different kind of avatar in virtual space. Right, so something like a character customization screen, not just the stats and attributes, but also cosmetic things matter to a lot of people. So constructing a meaningful experience out of that becomes a really important thing. But the kind of choice that I tend to be more interested in, and the kind of choice that we'll be talking about today, is more of the narrative variety. I don't know how many people have played Life is Strange, but this particular example, the kind of choice you're facing is, well, in this instance, the stepfather of a friend of yours busted the two of you teenagers smoking weed in the bedroom. And now you have the choice of, do you just kind of stand aside and let your friend take the blame, inflicting the anger of the stepfather, which they already have a problematic relationship going on there. But to be fair, she is the one to blame. Or do you take the blame upon yourself to kind of help out a friend? In the larger context of the game, it's actually a fairly meaningful choice, or so it feels at the time. But basically, these kind of decisions that don't necessarily affect something immediately quantifiable, measurable, but that do build up and have an impact on how the story unfolds. Narrative choices is what I'm going to call them. And there's a lot of games out there that are built exclusively or almost exclusively around these kind of narrative choices in different kinds of ways, and this includes AAA titles and indie games and everything in between. To the extent that choices matter has become a tag on Steam that you can look up, and that actually produces a lot of different kinds of games. But the irony with a lot of these games is some of the players have criticized some of the games, quite a few of the games, based on the premise that a lot of the time choices don't actually matter, contrary to what the tag suggests. You do something in the game, but then the game has its own kind of plot logic that it sticks to, or something happens and the player basically doesn't get the fulfillment at the end of the day of, okay, I was presented with series upon series of different choices, but it doesn't feel at the end of the day like the choices did anything particularly meaningful to me. And that is interesting for a genre or type of game that is premised on you'll be making choices. Why is that the case that people don't actually often feel like they get to make those choices that actually matter? And that is something I would like to explore, and that's something I would like to talk about from a narrative design perspective. Not as much from the game design perspective, not so much in terms of how do we deal with the mechanics side of things, but how do the choices that people make in those kind of branching narrative type of games, which can be extrapolated to other game genres, but that's the context I'm looking at, how can they be made more meaningful to the player? How do we make things that feel like they matter? And to make it really simple and to kind of just drill down into the gist of a narrative choice, I'll use as an example a type of game that some of you might be familiar with, but that hasn't been the most prominent type of game around for the past few decades, namely game books, right? So in the olden days, maybe around the 80s, if you didn't have a computer but you liked playing games, you might convince your parents to buy you a book. And the book would have, like a regular book, would have pages in it, but you wouldn't actually read it in order. Instead, what you would do is you'd read maybe the first passage, and it would give you a scenario, and then it would go, do you want to go left or do you want to go right? If you want to go left, turn to page number 7. If you want to go right, turn to this other page. And so you would navigate this book based on your choices in this kind of way. And some of these games are kind of making a return, either as kind of digital editions or masters of those older classics, or basically in newer forms of games like Detroit Become Human or Heavy Rain, or those kinds of games are essentially kind of similar to a more complex version of that basic thing, right? So just to give you a more visual idea, basically this would be the kind of game we'll be talking about. There's a textual introduction of a situation, and this is sort of from the middle of the game, so you don't get the context, but you can kind of reconstruct it from the example here. You're standing in some clearing, you see a group of human beings, there are 2 children, 3 men and a woman. Their belongings are wrapped in bundles that they carry slung over the shoulders. The clothes look well made and expensive, but they're dirty and torn. And at this moment in the game, you're flying from a threat, you're being pursued. So you need to kind of hedge your bets and figure out if this is a group of people that maybe needs help, or if there's someone who potentially poses a threat to you. So do you want to approach them, or do you want to avoid them? Those kinds of choices. They don't have to be binary, they can be certainly more than 2. But these are some of the basic kind of game mechanics that I think make it very clear when and how choices work. Now, I'm going to introduce some examples, and I hope you can see the examples now rather than the slides. These aren't from actual games. These are just things I specifically wrote as examples to illustrate the points that I'm trying to make. And I'll be reading them out to you. I hope you don't mind me reading too much. But basically what they are different types of choices of the kind you might find in a game book, and we'll talk about why some of them are potentially more meaningful and some of them are a little bit more problematic. Right, let's start with some of the pitfalls that you'll actually see in a lot of games. And this includes indie games, student-made games, game geometries, but also some larger budget titles sometimes step into this kind of territory as well. So let's start with the uninformed choice, right? So this is the context. After walking for many hours, you reach a fork in the road. Do you take the left path or do you take the right path? As much as I would like to play it as a game with you, we don't have the time, and I only have the time to actually write one of the options, so let's go for option number 1, because it doesn't seem like at this point you have enough information to make an informed decision. So let's say we take the left path. What happens? Well, you walk into the goblet ambush. You fight bravely, but vastly outnumbered, and soon succumb to your numerous wounds. Game over. You lost. Does it feel great as a choice? Not particularly, not to most people anyhow, because when making the choice of do you want to go left or do you go right, the game didn't really give you enough context. There was no information there to distinguish the good choice from the bad choice, and one of them was obviously the good one. So it's complete guesswork. It's a flip of a coin. You have a 50% chance of getting it right. This is not a rewarding choice to make because it doesn't really pose much of a challenge. And if you do go left and you end up being killed without having any prior warning or ways to avoid that, you feel like the game has cheated you, right? Because it wasn't fair on the player. Let's do another thing that often happens in visual novel type of games, which I label false choice. So different context, try to imagine the situation as a hypothetical imaginary game book, right? The ship is departing soon, but there's no sign of your companion yet, and no one in the docks seems to know where he is. Do you want to board the ship without him, or do you want to check the nearby tavern because you know the guy's a bit of a drunk? Well, let's say you're actually really desperate to make it on board the ship, and you go, let's board the ship without the guy. There's no time to look for Samuel, you decide. He's a grown man and must take care of himself. But then you remember the promise you made to Samuel's father, and guilt washes over you. You cannot just abandon him. Remembering how fond Samuel is of the bottle, you make a desperate dash to the nearby tavern, hoping to find him there. So what happened there, as you can see, is the player decides to do one thing, but the game tells them, hold on, for game purposes, narrative purposes, whatever it is, we actually need you to go to that tavern. So we'll give you some kind of excuse for why the choice you try to make is not workable, and we'll do something else. And again, that doesn't feel great, because what is the point of offering me a choice if you're going to just ignore it? Now, there's a lot of things you can do to hide this kind of thing or to make it a little bit more complex, but at a basic level, this is the thing that actually happens surprisingly much in visual novel types of games in particular, and it's just not a very rewarding thing to experience. Choice paralysis. One of my favorite kinds of things, when you think choices really matter, let's give the player as many of them as possible, and you end up with something like this. You walk into the rundown office building, the air is stale and smells of mold. Beyond the empty lobby lies a hallway with many nondescript doors and a staircase at the end. In one of these offices, Alice Jackson is hiding her invention. Where you go? Would you like to try door 101, 102, 103, 104, 105, all the way up to 110? Or would you like to take the stairs to the second floor? Or would you like to take the stairs to the third floor? Or maybe you'd like to check out the basement. With no additional information, the player is overloaded by the number of choices that they have. Where do you even start? How do you keep track of what you've already tried? Say it again. Or maybe someone just didn't mute their mic. Okay, I'm assuming I'm good to continue. So basically, this kind of situation isn't really perfect either, because the working memory and the executive function that human beings have is limited, and there's only so much information you can process at a time. This is way too much. There's too much stuff to take into consideration, but also there's not a whole lot of information about how the options are different from each other. So how can you do something that's slightly more interesting and slightly more meaningful to the player? Let's have a couple of examples illustrating some basic techniques you'll find used in games. So one of them is choice based on inference. So instead of a purely uninformed choice, where you don't really have the variables you need to understand to anticipate, you are given some information. You're not given the full information of what's going to be happening, because otherwise the game is predictable and boring, but you have something to think about. There are two doors in front of you. The left door is massive and has two large metal bolts securing it shut. Despite it being made of metal, there's a large dent in the door. The right door is smaller, made of wood, and ajar. Do you open the left door, or do you open the right door? So compared to the left path, right path example, this is a different kind of scenario, because you are actually given some information to consider. There's a massive metal door, there's bolts securing it shut, so there must be something that has to be kept on the other side, and there's a dent, so that something is potentially dangerous, maybe. You don't quite know, but that's food for thought. And then when you open the left door, something like that might happen. You open the door, suddenly the door bursts open with incredible force, sending you flying into the wall. Before you can scramble back to your feet, you're attacked by an enormous troll. Your death is very painful, but very quick. You died, not a very happy ending to get, but at least you were kind of warned, right? So you were thinking about what might be a good option to take, and you had some food for thought, and it may have played out differently, but at least partially that's on you. You decided to make that choice, and you were taking some things into account. Another kind of choice, potentially more interesting for me, is the trade-off. So again, left door, right door situation. The left door leads to the storage room, where you could replenish your flask, grab some rations, and possibly find a better weapon. However, the door is locked. The right door will take you to the underground passage and out of the cursed castle. But escaping the castle will only be the beginning of a long and arduous trek for which you're woefully underprepared. Do you want to cast a spell to unlock the left door using 1 mana, or do you want to escape through the right door for free? And you'll notice that you only have 1 mana left after exploring the castle. So now this becomes a choice of, I only have 1 spell that I can cast, potentially for the remainder of the game or the large stretch of the game ahead. Do you want to spend that on seeing what's behind the door, which may or may not be valuable, or do you want to keep that and save that for the difficult journey ahead, potentially missing out on the supplies behind the door? So let's say you do spend the mana, the door obediently gives way, but you're disappointed to see that the storage room is nearly empty. However, you do find some smoked meat and stale bread, which you may use to maybe restore some HP later down the road. And there's a dagger on the floor. That's going to be very useful, but better than nothing. So again, not maybe a choice that will make you happy. A lot of these endings will be pessimistic because I'm from Belarus for the most part, but you get the gist of it. There was a trade-off. You have to weigh your alternatives. You went for one of them and you get a result. Risk management is a kind of related concept where you end up with things, neither of which is ideal, and you have to kind of, again, compare what are the risks and what are the benefits and go for either the riskier solution potentially or the safer solution that has some shortcomings. So there are two ways to get to the fairy village. A shortcut through the goblin territory could get you there by sunset, but it's a dangerous journey to undertake alone. Alternatively, you could take the safer, longer road that goes around the goblin territory, but you would have to stay the night in Clarkville and pay for lodging, so lose money. There's also a risk that you may arrive too late for the fairy ceremony. And so again, there's a trade-off thing. There's the risk of potentially being attacked and losing HP and whatever if you do the shortcut, but you'll get there faster for the important quest story events and you won't have to spend money potentially. What do? Well, if you take the shortcut, actually, maybe that is a chance-based situation. A lot of these sort of original game books had a thing where you roll the dice to see what happens next, how lucky you are, right? So this is what happens here as well. You head into the goblin woods, trying to be as quiet as you can. It's difficult to see anything, and you soon lose your bearings. As you ponder over what to do next, you hear squeaky voices and light footsteps fast approaching. So let's see how lucky we are. Not very. Roll the dice, bad luck. As you try to get out of the goblin's way, each wake snaps underfoot. Suddenly everything goes quiet. The next moment, your neck is pierced by a crude arrow. So again, it was a risky decision, but you took the risk. In this particular instance, it didn't pay off. It could have paid off. Or you could have gone for the safer option, but maybe got to the worst story ending in the end of the day. And then there's the moral choice. And that's the kind of choice that a lot of the choice matter games look to exploit and make use of as sort of a game mechanic, where a lot of the time it doesn't really connect to getting the best, kind of the most advantageous outcome, but it's more about how do you feel about the situation as a human being that relates to the characters in the game. So let's have this example. As a Teshi priest, you gave an oath to never set foot in the Dark Valley. However, your quest is urgent, and cutting across the valley is the fastest way to deliver the scroll to the Grand Mistress. The safest, too, as the sun is shining bright, and the ghouls will be fast asleep in their lairs. If you are loath to betray your oath, you must go around the valley and risk an encounter with the bandits. So the safer option is actually kind of the morally wrong option because it goes against the oath that you gave, but at the same time, at the end of the day, it's the most practical one that might save people's lives. So let's say you decide to go into the Dark Valley. This is the sensible decision, you tell yourself, as you descend into the foul-smelling pit. Too many lives are at stake for you to be following every Teshi road. As you think that, you remember your late teacher Tyrus's words. Even the smallest rule is a cog in the machine of order. You also remember how Tyrus saved you from starving in the streets, and a pang of guilt sweeps over you, and you feel bad, and also, game mechanic, you lose one morale. So, yes, it's a practical choice, but it's not a choice that feels great, and the game actually measures how you feel, and that might affect some of the outcomes later down the road. So, as you can see, the nice thing about the letter 3 choices, at least I think, is the fact that they are ambivalent, that they're complex, that even if you have 2 choices, and especially actually if you have 2, 3, maybe 4, a manageable number of choices, there's no clear-cut winner. There's no right and wrong choice. They're all a little bit right and a little bit wrong, and that creates this kind of space for deliberation. I'm going to try and go back to my slides and see what are some of the takeaways that we can pick up from these examples, or that I try to sort of build into those examples. One thing that's important to realize is that making choices in and of itself isn't necessarily a fun thing to do. at least not for everybody, choices on fun in games when they meet a certain number of criteria, such as they need to be informed, at least to some extent. They're not just random wild guesses, shots in the dark. You have to consider some things in order to make a good decision. They have to be meaningfully different from each other. So you have choices where both choices kind of ultimately end up leading to the same thing. You may as well not have the choices at all. They have to be manageable, because if you have too much information to consider, whether it be a choice paralysis situation with too many choices or too many variables at stake in any given choice that you have to kind of measure against each other, then you may have a problem, because the cognitive capacity of a human being doesn't really allow that kind of complexity whilst also engaging with the story of the game. Balanced. So this idea that no choice is obviously the right choice or the wrong choice, and that's actually something you'll find that a lot of smaller scale educational games struggle with, where there's a right thing that's baked into the game, and the goal of the game is kind of get the players to understand and remember what the right answer is, which makes it a quiz more than a game. Impactful. So when you do make a choice, the game actually responds. Something happens in the game that makes a meaningful difference, that you feel like the choice at the end of the day had some kind of effect, rather than being a cosmetic thing that just gave you some kind of response, and then the story kind of returned to the rails that it's on, and just continued with the plot lines that the narrative designer thought of for you. And there's examples outside of game books that you can find that play around with these kind of considerations. If anyone's played Oxenfree, that's a really interesting one, where it's sort of like a walk-in simulator type of game, where most of the time what you do is you walk around and you talk to other people on the same island. And basically you just take sides in arguments. You decide who to decide with. You decide whether you need to be nicer to this person, or whether maybe you can mock and bully that person a little bit, because they probably deserve it. And you navigate these kind of relationships, which at the end of the day, the game keeps track of, and which will give you different endings for the story, depending on how you manage those relationships, some of which are more tragic or problematic than others. Right? But also this kind of balance of just being the nice person. If you try to be equally nice to everybody, then everybody will hate you, because that just doesn't work. So there's this kind of complexity in there, and it's quite realistic with how the dialogue is written, which I appreciate. If anyone's played the Banner Saga games, which are mostly known as a turn-based tactics role-playing game, but they also have these narrative segments straight out of the Oregon Trail, the 1970s game, where you travel with your caravan and you get different kind of scenarios which affect how many people will survive or starve to death or what happens. And some of these are really, really difficult, problematic kind of choices, which I think, in the interest of saving time, I'm not going to go into this specific example, but basically you make those decisions that affect both the story, but they also affect the game resources. How many people do you have in your group, which will matter for the gameplay as well. And then you have things like the Stanley Parable, the go-to example for any kind of experimental storytelling game, where what I find interesting about it, among many other things, is the way you make choices is not by making choices from the menu, because that doesn't have to be the way, but it's by where you go. So walking around the environment and choosing what door to go through, what to look at, whether to listen to the narrator who tells you what's going on, or do something contrary to what they're saying, that is the act of choosing. And the game responds to that. Right. So one more thing that I wanted to quickly go over is this concept of player rights. And I don't mean this in a sort of like Gamergate, what are the players' rights kind of way. I mean that in terms of how does the game play or treat the player fairly. And that's a concept that has existed for a fair amount of time. The term itself, the Player's Bill of Rights, was introduced by an interactive fiction or text-based game writer called Graham Nelson some 30 years ago. And the little book and the set of guidelines was mostly for interactive fiction games, but it's also quite useful for other types of games as well. And it's all about how do you treat the player fairly as a game. Now, importantly, the principles I'll list in a second are guidelines. So none of these are rules that you have to dogmatically follow. If it's a valid reason for doing it differently, then go ahead and do it differently. As long as you have an idea for how that contributes to the player experience, that's fine. But these are some pitfalls to avoid when, and there's actually an adaptation of the original book into sort of the modern game design context. I'll share my slides later if you want to check out the materials. So what are some of the player rights? Don't be killed without warning. And again, this works better for some games than others. If it's a shooter game, then maybe that's sort of less of a consideration, but even there is a good idea to give the player a heads up for, well, this place is kind of a safe zone, so you can look around and navigate. This place, better look around and listen to what's going on in the environment because somebody might be creeping up on you. Don't be given clearly, horribly unclear hints. So don't have a situation where the game is trying to communicate some information, but it obfuscates it so much the information is actually worthless. You can't decipher it, you give it some kind of riddle that doesn't make sense. And at the end of the day, if you fail because you haven't understood the riddle, that's on you. But you don't really feel like the game was too cryptic, and adventure games have tended to do that a bit too much in the past, especially. To be able to win without experiencing past lives, and you'll find interesting examples that play around with that, but generally speaking, you don't have to die in the game first and then go back in order to be able to figure out how to do it properly. You need to have the information available to you during the playthrough, or so Nelson argued. To be able to win without the knowledge of future events. So you don't have to have the gift of foresight in order to understand how to make your way through the game. And don't have the game closed off without warning. So again, the thing that would happen with adventure games in the past would be sometimes you do the wrong thing and the game becomes unwinnable and it forgets to tell you about that. So you keep trying and then you realize hours later that you don't actually have a chance to win anymore. Don't do boring things for the sake of it. So one principle from Scott Adams, I think the game designer, is walking is very rarely gameplay. That's a similar thing. If you're doing something that feels tedious, there better be a really good point behind it. Have reasonable freedom of action, so don't be sort of on a rail track where the game takes you along, but also don't burden the player with too many choices. Don't depend too much on luck, so if everything is the flip of the coin and the player's skill doesn't matter, that's a problem as well. And don't be given too many red herrings. I don't know if people know what a red herring is. Basically, it's a distraction that is strategically placed somewhere to confuse you, but it doesn't have a practical purpose. Quickly as I can, because I'm running out of time, I'll give you an example from another game book from way back called Blood Bones. It was a game book in the Fighting Fantasy game series that's now been remade into a digital game you can get on Steam, which I wouldn't necessarily recommend. The goal of the game, this is the thing you need to know for the example to make sense, is to find and defeat an evil pirate that killed your family. So it's a revenge story. And the game also keeps track of how many turns you make because your time is limited. And if you spend and waste too much time, then basically you can't win. And so it's important for the player to be strategic and not try everything, just focus on what choices they make. This is what the digital adaptation looks like. It kind of replicates the feel of the book. Right, so I'll give you some examples of the issues because there's plenty of issues there. One of them, at the very beginning of the game, you have multiple options of what you can do because you need to find where that pirate is. And you can go to the taverns and the inns, or you can go into a really dangerous district of the city and see if you can find some information there. Or maybe you can go to the markets and buy some props and some stuff for your journey. Or maybe you can go through local cults and see if the cultists know anything. Or maybe you can ask the authorities for help. Or maybe you can just go, screw it, I'm gonna walk around the coast because presumably they're pirates, they have a ship. Maybe I'll find the ship. And that's a lot of choices considering that the game keeps track of your turns. So there's a lot of pressure on the player to choose something and be efficient, but at the same time, you don't really have enough information to know which is a sensible option to go for. Then when you do go, for example, to the markets, you have two kinds of markets you can go to. You can go for the regular markets, or you can go to the more exotic, expensive one. And if you go to the expensive one, you can choose out of a selection of expensive magical items to choose from. You don't really know what they do. You don't really know what the difference between them is, but you can choose some. You don't have enough money to get like 3 of them. You have to choose 1 or maybe 2. And a lot of them are red herrings. They don't really do anything in the game, so it doesn't really feel great to choose something just, again, as a shot in the dark, right? And there's too little information. And then the thing where the point where I quit the game when I was playing it, I remember, was when you find the pirates, you go to their hiding place. You're caught. You are put into sort of like a hold at the bottom of the ship, and the ship is set to ground. And if you didn't get one specific item, the shark's teeth bracelet, that one item from that one market, you may not have even gone to in the game because there's so many other things you could have done, then you're going to die. So without the past experience, or without knowing what would happen, or without being extremely lucky to have made just the right choices without any information that you could base them on, you're going to die and lose the game and have to restart. So basically, those are all the things that go against Graham Nelson's examples of how you design choices for games. So if I were to try and sort of summarize that as a takeaway point, maybe, a lot of these choice design things has to do with balancing things. Balancing player skill against chance. If it's completely skill-based, then it's a bit maybe too predictable. If it's completely chance-based, then the skill and the thinking doesn't matter anymore. Knowledge and guesswork. So don't give the player the full information, because otherwise it's just like reading a walkthrough. But also don't have them guess randomly without information, because that's not something that feels great. So have them make an educated guess. Risk and reward. Have them decide, do they want to go for the riskier option, or that also gives them more reward, or for the safer option that might not result in as favorable an outcome. Again, skill and challenge, right? That's a classic game design maxim anyhow. Make the challenge level slightly above the player's ability, so they have to actually make an effort and challenge themselves. Enjoyment and frustration. So James G also has this idea of pleasurable frustration. A lot of the time, the fun of playing games comes from kind of oscillating between I'm in control and this is so frustrating, I have to keep trying. Determinism and randomness. Again, there may be a predetermined sequence of events, but there may be also chance-based elements that come into play and that make for nice kind of variety and unpredictability, and also the choices that are mutually exclusive. So there is a difference between the choices, and maybe you can only get one of the multiple things, all of which are desirable, or one of the bad outcomes, at least one of which is inevitable. So these are some takeaways that I wanted to highlight in this talk, and I think I'm more or less barely on time. So thank you, everybody. And if you have any questions, then do feel free to ask.
Thank you very much, Mikhail Fiadotau, about his presentation with the theme of choices. And I have prepared two students with two questions. The first one will be Adriana Jaszenska. She is a student of the first class of game design, and she prepared a question for you.
Yes, thank you. I firstly want to say hello and thank you for a great presentation. I enjoyed it. And my question is that, do you think that the outgoing of giving the freedom of choice to players, like for example, playing for villain or doing something illegal in the game, can lead to the misunderstanding of general audience or players of the intentions of developers, like that violent behavior in the game can lead to violent behavior in real life, like the intention of the developer will be misunderstood what they wanted to say with the game?
Thank you for this. I think there's multiple things sort of loaded into your question, because basically it's like, do I think that video games pose a risk in terms of violent behavior and the age-old games and violence debate? I think it's a load of bollocks for the most part. Which is not to ignore the fact that organizations like ISIS have been using video games in training, but those are specifically made for that particular kind of purpose, right? And military stuff, that's a whole different territory. Can the players misread the designers and developers' intention and read into the story something that is contrary to the message they were trying to do? That's the risk that's always there, I think, not just for video games, but books, any work of fiction, really. With the games, the thing is, well, you have some agency, but that agency is controlled by the narrative designers of the game. There's a concept of sort of game literacy, right? So being able to understand how games work and how to read and critically analyze them. That's quite important because it's not only about playing as a villain and thinking, does the game mean that it's okay to hijack cars and beat people around with a baseball bat? It's also doing something in the game that's supposed to have maybe like a serious game. So to go back to the challenge presentation, a game for change kind of setting. There have been examples and there have been studies where, say, students in a journalism school would play a news game that is explicitly meant to be critical of something, like the McDonald's game is an interesting example. It's a game that's very much anti-McDonald's, despite the name. It criticizes the business practices because it satirizes them. But it does so in this kind of tongue-in-cheek, subtle way, and a lot of people play this and they kind of completely overlook that aspect. So for them, it was, yeah, it's a game that simulates how the business model of McDonald's works, and I'm not very interested in that kind of thing, so that's what I took out of it. So the critical intention behind it was completely lost on them. And that's a real danger that you have to face as a game designer, and I'm afraid the only way to navigate it is to really playtest a lot and see if people respond in the way you want them to, or if they don't, how do you adjust the game to make that more transparent. But at the same time, games are about agency, so you may actually accept the fact that there will be conflicting interpretations and people will have different, ways to resonate with the game and to interpret it. I hope this was a rambling answer, but that's my initial response.
Okay, thank you for your answer. And next question will put to you, a student from the first class of game design, Rada Králova. So time for your question.
Yes, hello. So my question is, there are a lot of AAA games that when they began, they were just simple games. They had one story and there weren't any choices in them, but as the series progressed, they turned more to the choice-based type of format, for example, Assassin's Creed, but the choices kind of, since the choices weren't like present from the first game, they don't really matter because they are changed by the later games or the novels, and if there is even a point to that, like changing the just story-based game to the choice-based game because it's popular now or something like that. And also maybe what are your favorite choice-based games, or you consider the best choice-based games?
I'll start with the first point because games like Assassin's Creed are interesting to me in that basically with any franchise, with any kind of series, the problem that you face is series have to continue. So you cannot give the player an absolute freedom to end up in different kinds of places because the story has to carry over into the next installment. And that's not just, it's also the case for purely choice-based games like the Walking Dead series by Telltale Games, right? Every next season has to start from a point where the player knows what happened in the past. So basically, despite the fact that you keep making choices throughout 5 episodes of the season, at the end of the day, it has to come to a point where the basic events that happen will be the same for every player. Otherwise, they'll end up in different situations, or maybe the game will just ignore the different possible outcomes, and the next installment of the series starts from an assumption of this is the canonical ending. Also doesn't feel great because then the game has ignored the choices you made in the previous round. There's always this kind of calculated decision of how do we present the player with kind of an illusion of agency, but the plot events stay functional for us, we can continue with them. And that's a choice that works better when you realize from the start that I'm probably working on a series or a franchise, which a lot of these games kind of do, but a lot of the time it's also a case of you kind of discover halfway through the process, oh, this game is actually doing really well. I might want to do, we should probably do a part 2, a sequel, and we didn't really consider that at all when writing out the story, and then you're in trouble. So I don't really have a definitive answer how to navigate that, but it is a challenge that is particular to these kind of games. And then there is the valid question of to what extent do you even need choices because they may not help the player experience that much. They might frustrate them, anything. But the favorite games that I have is, strangely enough, it's a difficult question for me to answer because I tend to just think of the latest thing that I played, because there's been so many that I liked. I think the Banner Saga was nice in that it also sticks to kind of a linear story, but there are decision points which will affect your experience to a large extent, and I thought they were pretty clever about it. More recently, although it's not a super recent game, I played Night in the Woods, which is a sort of interesting kind of metaphorical indie type of game. But also, it doesn't even have to be a choice-based game. I'll just finish at this point. If you play something like Celeste, I don't know if people know Celeste, the platformer, you'll see that there are actually choices. It's not a game that has a lot of dialogue. It has a basic story, but mostly it's about platforming. But the choices you make as a player are things like, do I want to collect that strawberry thing that is really, really hard to get, or do I want to move on to the next level? So it's a risk and reward kind of thing. Do I want to keep trying, or do I go for the easier thing? Do I want to go and try this kind of slightly more difficult level, or am I okay with just the basic story? And then at the end of the process, the game kind of reflects on that, and you can make your way to the good ending, but there's different flavors, and it will reward persistence to a larger extent. And I think it's a nice way to kind of subtly integrate some decisions into the level design without making it about a menu-based thing you have options to choose from. Right, I think that's about it.